The train's whistle cut through the Kansas wind like a warning. Jonah Reed stood on that platform with a photograph in his calloused hand and a contract in his pocket, expecting a quiet woman who'd learned to make herself small. What stepped off that train instead was a force he hadn't prepared for. A woman in travel-worn leather boots, carrying a wooden case that didn't hold dresses, and eyes that had seen things she wasn't about to apologize for. In 30 seconds, everything Jonah thought he knew about this arrangement shattered. This wasn't the bride he ordered. This was something else entirely. If you want to see how a cowboy's careful plan falls apart when the wrong woman turns out to be exactly right, stay with me through every twist of this story. And when you're done, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see just how far this tale travels. The morning Jonah Reed decided to send for a bride, the sky over his Kansas ranch had been the color of old pewter, threatening rain that never came. That was 3 months ago. 3 months of waiting, of second-guessing, of wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his 34 years. Now he stood on the weathered platform of Seneca Station, that same gray sky pressing down on him, and felt the weight of his decision settling into his bones like the ache before a storm. The train was late. Around him, the small crowd shuffled and murmured, a merchant waiting for supplies, 2 ranch hands heading west for work, Mrs. Talbot from the general store picking up her sister from Topeka. They all knew why Jonah was there. In a town of 300 souls, everybody knew everything, and the news that the Reed Ranch's solitary owner had finally broken down and ordered himself a wife had spread like wildfire through dry grass. Jonah could feel their sideways glances, the barely concealed curiosity. He kept his eyes on the eastern horizon, where the tracks disappeared into heat shimmer, his hat pulled low, his jaw set in that expression that had kept most people at a comfortable distance for years. He wasn't a cruel man. He wasn't even particularly unfriendly. But Jonah Reed had learned early that silence was safer than conversation, that distance prevented disappointment, and that the only thing you could truly rely on was land, work, and the simple fact that if you expected nothing from people, they couldn't let you down. The ranch had been his father's and his grandfather's before that. 1,500 acres of prairie grassland, a sturdy house built from native limestone, cattle that knew the routine better than most men. For 5 years since his father's death, Jonah had run it alone. He'd convinced himself he preferred it that way. But loneliness, he discovered, wasn't the same as solitude. Loneliness was waking before dawn to a house so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. It was cooking meals for one and eating them standing at the kitchen window, looking out at land that stretched forever in every direction with no one to share the view. It was going weeks without hearing his own voice, except to speak to the horses, his words eventually becoming as sparse and functional as fence posts. His closest neighbor, Dutch Morrison, had planted the idea 6 months back. They'd been mending fence line together, working in the comfortable quiet of men who didn't need to fill every silence with talk, when Dutch had mentioned his own mail-order bride Ingrid, who'd arrived from Minnesota 2 years prior. Changed everything, Dutch had said, not looking at Jonah, just driving another post into the hard earth. Didn't think it would. Figured it'd just be nice to have help with the house, someone to cook. But it's more than that. It's having someone to talk to at the end of the day. Someone who cares if you come back safe when you ride out in bad weather. Someone who makes the house feel like it's worth coming back to. Jonah had grunted something non-committal, but the words had burrowed into him like ticks, impossible to dig out completely. He'd thought about it for 3 more months before finally writing to the agency in St. Louis. Even then, he'd almost torn up the letter a dozen times before posting it. The whole thing felt desperate, transactional in a way that scraped against his pride. But the alternative, another 5 years, 10 years, 20 years of that crushing silence, had finally pushed him past his resistance. The agency had sent him 3 potential matches. He'd chosen Margaret Hayes based on a brief letter written in neat, careful handwriting that suggested education and practicality. She was a widow, 30 years old, from a small town in Illinois. Her photograph showed a woman with a pleasant, unremarkable face, hair pulled back severely, expression neutral. She looked like someone who understood hard work, who wouldn't expect romance or grand gestures, who would be satisfied with partnership and mutual respect. That was what Jonah wanted. No complications, no drama, no expectations beyond what they'd both agreed to. A working partnership, companionship without demands, a shared life built on practical foundations. He'd written back, and they'd exchanged 3 more letters, each one brief and businesslike, outlining expectations and responsibilities. She would help with the house, the cooking, the garden. He would provide for her, protect her, treat her with respect. They would marry quickly, the law required it, and neither of them saw reason to delay. It had all seemed reasonable, manageable, safe. The train whistle cut through his thoughts, distant but growing closer. Around him, the small crowd shifted, came alert. Jonah's hand moved unconsciously to his vest pocket, where he'd tucked Margaret's photograph and her last letter, folded together. He pulled them out now, studying the photograph one more time in the harsh afternoon light. A plain woman, he thought again. Someone who wouldn't disrupt the careful patterns of his life too much. Someone quiet. The train rounded the bend, massive and inevitable, trailing black smoke against that pewter sky. The platform trembled under Jonah's boots as the engine approached, brakes squealing, steam hissing from the undercarriage like something alive and angry. Jonah had expected nervousness. What he felt instead was a strange, hollow resignation, as if he were watching himself from a distance, observing a man making a choice that couldn't be unmade. The train shuddered to a stop, car after car settling into stillness. Doors opened. Passengers began to emerge. A family with 3 small children, an elderly man with a cane, 2 women in fashionable city dresses clearly not prepared for Kansas dust. Jonah scanned each face, matching them against the photograph in his hand. None of them fit. His jaw tightened. Perhaps she'd missed the train. Perhaps she'd changed her mind at the last moment, realized what a fool's errand this was, heading into the middle of nowhere to marry a stranger. Perhaps that would be for the best. Then she appeared, and everything Jonah thought he knew fell away like cheap paint in a hard rain. She stepped down from the 3rd car back, and even from 30 feet away, Jonah knew immediately this wasn't the woman in the photograph. This woman moved with a confidence that made people unconsciously step aside. She wore traveling clothes, a practical split-riding skirt in dark brown wool, a fitted jacket, boots that had seen serious use. Her hair, instead of being pulled back severely, fell in a thick braid over one shoulder, the color of honey catching late afternoon sun. But it was her face that stopped Jonah's breath in his chest. Strong rather than soft, with high cheekbones and a jaw that suggested stubbornness. And her eyes, even at this distance, he could see they were alert, assessing, taking in everything around her with an intensity that was almost predatory. This woman didn't look like she needed rescuing. She looked like she could handle herself just fine. In her right hand, she carried a worn leather travel bag. Slung over her left shoulder was a long wooden case, the kind that... Jonah's eyes narrowed. He knew that kind of case. He had 2 of them himself back at the ranch. That was a rifle case. The woman scanned the platform, her gaze moving over faces methodically until it landed on him. Something flickered in her expression, recognition maybe, or assessment. She started toward him with long, purposeful strides that covered the distance faster than he expected. Up close, she was taller than he'd imagined, maybe 5'7", and she looked him directly in the eye without the slightest hint of demureness. This close, he could see her eyes were green, the color of new prairie grass, and they were studying him with the same intensity he was using on her. "Jonah Reed?" Her voice was low and clear, not harsh but not soft either, a voice used to being heard. "That's right." He couldn't quite keep the question out of his tone. "But you're not... Margaret Hayes?" She shifted her travel bag to her other hand, and he noticed the movement was economical, practiced. "No, I'm Mara Lowell. There was a complication. Margaret fell ill 2 days before departure. Food poisoning, the doctors think. She asked me to come in her place." Jonah's mind stuttered over that information like a wagon wheel hitting a rock. "She asked you to come in her place?" "That's right." Mara's chin lifted slightly, a gesture that was pure challenge. "We were both registered with the same agency. When she couldn't travel, she knew you'd be here expecting someone, and she didn't want you to make the journey for nothing. I was willing to fulfill the contract." Just like that. Jonah heard the flatness in his own voice. "You decided to marry a stranger heading to the middle of Kansas just because another woman couldn't make it." Something flickered across Mara's face. Too quick to read, but it might have been anger or amusement or both. I had my own reasons for wanting to leave St. Louis. The destination didn't much matter. And yes, before you ask, the agency was informed. Everything is legal and proper. I have all the paperwork. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded envelope, which she held out to him. Jonah took it automatically, but he didn't look at it. He was still trying to process this turn of events, trying to reconcile the quiet, plain woman he'd been expecting with this force of nature standing in front of him. "This isn't what I agreed to," he said finally. "No," Mara agreed, and her voice was steady, factual. "It's not. You're free to send me back on tomorrow's train. I'll understand completely. But I'm here now, and I'll keep my end of the bargain if you'll keep yours. I'm a hard worker. I can cook, clean, mend, ride, and handle a rifle if needed. I don't complain, and I don't make drama. What I need is a place to stay and a legitimate marriage contract. What you need, according to the letters, is partnership and practical help around a ranch. The rest—" She paused, and for the first time something softer entered her expression. "We can figure out as we go." Around them, the platform had emptied. Even Mrs. Talbot had taken her sister and disappeared, though Jonah was certain she'd be spreading this new development throughout town before sunset. He looked down at the envelope in his hand, then back at Mara. She stood there without fidgeting, without trying to make herself smaller or more appealing, just waiting for his decision, with a patience that somehow felt like strength rather than submission. Jonah Reed had built his life on careful planning, on knowing what to expect, on avoiding surprises. This woman was the opposite of everything he'd tried to arrange. And yet, there was something in her eyes, not desperation, not pleading, but a kind of fierce determination that he recognized because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. This wasn't a woman running toward something. This was a woman running from something, yes, but more than that, choosing something, claiming something. He'd been alone for 5 years. He'd sent for a bride because the alternative was drowning in silence. Whatever else Mara Lowell might be, she didn't look like someone who'd let him drown. "All right," he said, and watched surprise flash across her face, the first unguarded expression he'd seen from her. "The wagon's this way." He turned and started walking, half expecting her to stay rooted to the platform, to call after him with questions or conditions. Instead, he heard her boots on the wooden planks behind him, keeping pace. His wagon was tied up behind the station. Old but well-maintained, it had been his father's before it was his. Jonah had hitched up his 2 most reliable horses that morning, wanting to make a good impression. Now he wasn't sure what impression he'd made or what impression had been made on him. He loaded her travel bag into the back of the wagon, then reached for the wooden case. Mara's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. "I'll handle that," she said, her voice sharp for the first time. Their eyes met. Jonah could feel the strength in her grip, not trying to hurt him, just making a point. He nodded slowly and released his hold on the case. Mara lifted it herself, settling it carefully in the wagon bed with a gentleness that confirmed his suspicion about what it contained. Then she pulled herself up onto the wagon seat without waiting for assistance, arranging her skirts efficiently, her hands folding in her lap. Jonah climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue. The horses started forward, pulling them away from the station and onto the dusty main street of Seneca. For several minutes, they rode in silence. The town gave way to open prairie almost immediately. This was frontier country, where civilization was still just a suggestion scratched onto an endless landscape. The road stretched ahead of them, 2 worn ruts through grass that moved like water in the constant wind. Jonah was acutely aware of the woman beside him. She sat straight-backed but not rigid, her eyes scanning the horizon the way his did, checking for weather, for landmarks, for anything out of place. Not the posture of a city woman unused to open spaces. This was someone who knew how to read land. "How far is the ranch?" Mara asked, breaking the silence. "About 12 miles. We'll be there before dark if the weather holds." She nodded, processing this. Then, "Tell me about it." "The ranch. 1,500 acres, cattle operation mostly. Some crops, but the land's better for grazing. House is stone, built by my grandfather. Sturdy, practical. 3 bedrooms, though I only use 1. Kitchen's big, my mother insisted on that. Root cellar, barn, stable, chicken coop, smokehouse. He was describing it like he'd describe property to a buyer, he realized. Factual, detached. But how else was he supposed to talk to this stranger who would be his wife? Any help? Mara asked. Hands? I've got 2 men who work the cattle during busy seasons, spring calving, fall roundup. They don't live on the property. Otherwise, it's just been me. That's a lot of work for 1 man. It is. More silence. The wagon creaked and rattled over the uneven road. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals, hunting. You have questions, Mara said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Jonah glanced at her. You planning to answer them? Depends on the questions. Fair enough, he supposed. The rifle. What about it? Not many women travel with a rifle. Not many women travel alone to marry strangers in Kansas, either. She turned to look at him directly. I know how to use it. My father taught me when I was 12. I'm a good shot, better than good. If that bothers you, I can keep it packed away. Doesn't bother me. And it didn't, he realized. If anything, it made him respect her more. Where are you from? Originally? Maryland, but I've lived in St. Louis for the past 2 years. Doing what? Mara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Working. Various things. Whatever paid. The evasion was obvious, but Jonah decided not to push. They'd have time to learn about each other, or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe this whole thing was a disaster waiting to unfold. You said Margaret was sick, he said instead. You friends with her? We knew each other through the agency. We talked a few times. Mara's hands tightened slightly in her lap. She was kind. I think you would have liked her. Would have. Past tense, as if that arrangement was dead and buried now. Why'd you sign up with the agency? Jonah asked. The question came out more blunt than he intended, but he was past pretending this situation was normal. Mara was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, because I needed to leave St. Louis and I needed it to be permanent, legal. A marriage contract provides that. And before you ask, no, I'm not running from the law. I haven't committed any crimes. I'm not wanted by anyone. The careful phrasing of that last sentence caught his attention. Not wanted by anyone, as in the law perhaps. But there was something else in her tone, something that suggested there might be someone wanting her in a different way. Someone going to come looking for you? He asked directly. No. The word was flat, final. I made sure of that. They rode on. The sun was starting its slow descent toward the horizon, turning the prairie grass gold. In the distance, Jonah could see the dark line of trees that marked the creek running through his property. Almost home. What are you expecting from this marriage? Mara asked suddenly. Honestly. Jonah considered the question. He could give her the same practical answer he'd given in his letters to Margaret. Partnership. Help around the ranch. Companionship. But something about Mara's directness demanded equal honesty. I've been alone for 5 years, he said slowly. I thought I preferred it that way. Turns out I was wrong. I don't need romance or grand gestures. I don't need someone to fix me or save me or whatever. I just need... He paused, searching for words. I need someone who makes the silence less empty. Someone who cares if I come home safe. Someone to build something with instead of just maintaining what's already here. He could feel her eyes on him, studying his profile. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its edge. That's honest, she said. I appreciate that. Your turn. What do you need? Mara looked back out at the prairie. When she answered, her voice was quieter, but no less certain. Safety, legitimacy. A place to start over where no one knows my history. A partnership where I'm not... She stopped, then started again. Where I'm not owned. Where my value isn't just in being decorative or obedient. Where I can work and contribute and be respected for that. Jonah heard all the things she wasn't saying in the spaces between those words. Someone had tried to own her. Someone had valued her for the wrong things. Someone had made her feel like she needed to earn respect instead of having it given freely. I can offer that, he said. The not being owned part. The respect. The rest of it. Can you? There was a challenge in the question. You sent for a mail-order bride. That's not exactly a transaction between equals. Maybe not, but I didn't send for property or a servant. I sent for a partner. If you're willing to be that, then we're equal enough. And if I'm not what you expected? Not quiet and obedient and grateful? Jonah almost smiled, the first time he'd come close since she'd stepped off that train. I can see you're not that already. If I was going to send you back, I'd have done it at the station. Then why didn't you? He thought about that. There were practical reasons. He'd already paid for the contract, made the commitment, told the whole town. But that wasn't it, not really. Because you look like someone who means what you say, he answered finally. And because I'd rather have an honest challenge than a false comfort. Mara turned to stare at him fully now, and he could feel the weight of her assessment. After a long moment, something in her posture relaxed infinitesimally. All right, Jonah Reed, she said, let's see what we can build. The ranch came into view as they crested the last rise before the creek crossing. Jonah watched Mara's face as she took in the sight. The stone house with its deep porch and sturdy roof, the barn that his father had built to last generations, the corrals and outbuildings arranged in practical efficiency. It wasn't grand, but it was well-maintained, solid, real. It's good land, Mara said, and he heard approval in her voice. It is. They crossed the creek at the shallow ford, water splashing up around the wagon wheels. The horses knew they were close to home and picked up their pace slightly. Within minutes, Jonah was pulling up in front of the house. He set the brake and jumped down, then moved to help Mara, but she was already climbing down on her own, landing lightly in the dust. She stood there, hands on her hips, looking at the house like she was measuring it. I'll show you around, Jonah said, pulling her travel bag from the wagon. He reached for the rifle case, then remembered. You want to bring that yourself? Please. He led her up the porch steps. They were swept clean, the railing he'd mended just last week, and through the front door into the main room. It was spare but clean, furniture built for function rather than beauty. The stone walls kept it cool in summer, warm in winter. Windows on 3 sides let in light. Kitchen's through there, Jonah gestured. Bedrooms upstairs. There's a pump in the kitchen, but we also have the creek, root cellars accessed from outside around back. Mara was moving through the space slowly, her eyes taking in everything. The rifle mounted above the fireplace, the books on the shelf. Not many, but some. The worn chair by the window where he did his evening reading. You keep it clean, she observed. I'm not a slob. I didn't say you were. She turned to face him. Where do you want me to sleep? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implication. They both knew what it was really asking. There's 3 bedrooms upstairs, Jonah said carefully. Master bedroom, that's mine. 2 smaller rooms. You can take your pick of those. We'll need to marry quick for the legality of it, but that doesn't mean... He paused, choosing words. We can take our time with the rest. Figure things out as we go. Mara's expression softened slightly. Relief, maybe. Thank you. I'll get your bag upstairs. You can get settled. There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry. He started for the stairs, but her voice stopped him. Jonah? He turned back. I know this isn't what you planned, Mara said. I know I'm not who you expected, but I meant what I said at the station. I'll keep my end of the bargain. I'll work hard. I'll be honest with you. And I won't run. Something about the way she said that last part, won't run, made him wonder who or what she'd run from before. But that was a conversation for another day. Same, he said simply. We'll figure it out. He carried her bag upstairs and set it in the smaller bedroom that faced east, the one with morning light. When he came back down, Mara had taken off her jacket and was standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the land beyond. From behind, with her braid hanging down her back and her shoulders squared, she looked like she'd been standing in that kitchen forever, like maybe she belonged there. It was probably a dangerous thought to have this soon, but Jonah couldn't quite shake it. There's a minister in town, he said. Reverend Crawford. We could ride in tomorrow, get the paperwork done. All right. You sure about this? Mara turned to face him, and her green eyes were steady, certain. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Jonah nodded slowly. He believed her, though he wasn't entirely sure why. There was something in her voice, in the set of her jaw, that spoke of decisions made and commitments kept. I'll leave you to get settled then, he said. I need to check on the stock before dark. He was halfway to the door when she spoke again. "Jonah? That case, the wooden one. It's not just a rifle." He stopped, looked back. Mara's expression was difficult to read. "There's also a violin, in case you were wondering if I was only about survival." Then she turned back to the window, effectively dismissing him. Jonah walked out into the cooling evening, his mind churning. A rifle and a violin. Defense and beauty carried with equal weight. A woman running from something but refusing to arrive helpless. Someone who valued strength and art in the same breath. This wasn't at all what he'd signed up for. Standing in his barnyard, looking back at the house where light was starting to glow in the kitchen window, Jonah realized he might have gotten something better, or at least something more real. The night settled around the ranch, stars appearing one by one in a sky that seemed to stretch forever. Inside, Mara Lowell unpacked her few belongings and tried not to think about the life she'd left behind or the uncertain future she'd just committed to. Outside, Jonah Reed tended his animals and tried not to think about the quiet woman he'd expected or the complicated reality he'd received instead. Neither of them slept easily that first night. But in the morning, they would ride to town together and sign papers that would bind them legally, if not yet emotionally. They would become husband and wife in the eyes of the law, two strangers trying to build something from practical necessity and desperate hope. Neither of them knew yet whether it would work, but both of them, in their own ways, were determined to try. The morning sun was barely a suggestion on the eastern horizon when Mara woke to the sound of boots on wooden stairs. She'd slept fitfully, every creak of the unfamiliar house jolting her awake, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife she kept under her pillow. Old habits died hard. She dressed quickly in the dim pre-dawn light, plaiting her hair with efficient fingers, pulling on the same traveling clothes from yesterday. Her other dresses, all two of them, could wait. Today she needed to appear strong, capable, unshakable. Today she would ride into town beside Jonah Reed and sign papers that would change everything. When she descended the stairs, she found him in the kitchen, fully dressed, pouring coffee from a battered pot. He looked up at her approach, and she saw the brief flicker of surprise cross his face. He hadn't expected her to be up this early. "Coffee?" he offered, his voice still rough with sleep. "Please." He poured her a cup without asking how she took it. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, black as midnight, and she drank it gratefully. They stood in the quiet kitchen, two strangers about to legally bind their lives together, drinking bitter coffee while the world outside slowly brightened. "We should leave within the hour," Jonah said finally. "Service is at 10, but the Reverend will want to talk to us first. Ask questions." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that establish we're both entering this willingly, that neither of us is being coerced." He paused. "That we understand what marriage means." Mara met his eyes over the rim of her cup. "And what does it mean? To you?" Jonah set his cup down on the worn wooden table, his large hands wrapping around it like he needed something to hold on to. "It means I make a promise and keep it. It means you'll have my name, my protection, and everything I can provide. It means I won't lie to you, won't raise my hand to you, and won't treat you like property." The specificity of that last part made her wonder what he'd seen in his life to make him say it so deliberately. "And in return?" she asked quietly. "The same. Honesty, effort, showing up." He lifted his eyes to hers. "That's all. The rest, affection, intimacy, whatever else people expect from marriage, that comes if it comes. Or it doesn't. But the foundation has to be solid first." Mara felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "That's more reasonable than most men would be." "I'm not most men." "No," she agreed, studying him in the growing light. "You're not." They ate a quick breakfast of bread and preserves. Jonah apologized for the simplicity, but Mara waved him off. She'd eaten far worse and been grateful for it. Then she went upstairs to change into her best dress, the one she'd packed carefully for exactly this occasion. It was dove gray with simple lines, high-necked and long-sleeved, respectable enough for church but not so formal as to look like she was trying too hard. She'd bought it secondhand in St. Louis with the last of her savings, checking carefully for stains or tears, letting out the hem to fit her height. In the small mirror above the washstand, She barely recognized herself. She looked softer somehow, more vulnerable in gray than she ever did in her traveling clothes. She almost changed back. Then she remembered what was at stake and forced herself to leave the dress on. When she came downstairs, Jonah was waiting by the door, also changed into what must be his Sunday clothes: clean trousers, a pressed shirt, a vest that had seen better days but was well maintained. He'd shaved, and without the perpetual shadow of stubble, he looked younger, less weathered. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her. "You look," he started, then stopped, as if unsure whether complimenting her was appropriate. "Respectable," she supplied. "I was going to say pretty, but respectable works too." The unexpected honesty of it caught her off guard. She felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned away, busying herself with her gloves. Behind her, she heard him clear his throat. "Wagon's ready," he said, and she was grateful he didn't push the moment further. The ride into Seneca was different from yesterday's journey. Morning light softened everything, making the prairie look less harsh, more welcoming. Birds sang in the grass, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. The world felt new, full of possibility, and Mara tried to hold on to that feeling even as anxiety twisted in her stomach. "Nervous?" Jonah asked, his eyes on the road ahead. "Wouldn't you be?" "I am." The admission surprised her. He didn't seem like a man who admitted weakness easily. "You could still change your mind," she said, testing him. "Send me back on tomorrow's train." "Could say the same to you." "I asked you first." Jonah was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. "I'm not changing my mind. I said I'd do this, so I'll do it. But that doesn't mean I'm not nervous. Getting married is—" He paused, searching for words. "It's a hell of a thing, even when it's practical." "Especially when it's practical," Mara corrected. "At least when people marry for love, they have that to fall back on when things get hard." "And what will we have?" She considered the question seriously. "A contract, a commitment, stubbornness, maybe." "Stubbornness?" Jonah almost smiled. "That I've got plenty of." "Me too." "I noticed." They fell into a companionable silence after that, and Mara found herself relaxing incrementally. This man beside her wasn't what she'd expected, harder in some ways, softer in others. He didn't fill silences with meaningless chatter, didn't seem to need constant reassurance or validation. He simply existed, solid and present, and there was something deeply comforting about that. As they approached town, she saw him straighten slightly, his jaw setting. Preparing himself for judgment, she realized. For whispers and stares. A mail-order bride was scandalous enough, but a mail-order bride who wasn't the one expected? That would be gossip gold. "Let them talk," she said quietly, surprising herself. Jonah glanced at her. "What?" "The town. Let them talk. Let them stare. We know what this is. That's all that matters." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "You always this direct? You want me to lie?" "No, direct is good, just unexpected." The church sat at the end of Main Street, a simple wooden structure with a white steeple that needed paint. Already people were gathering, families in their Sunday best, children running between adults, the hum of conversation carrying on the morning air. When Jonah pulled the wagon up to the hitching post, the conversation didn't exactly stop, but it shifted. Mar could feel eyes turning toward them, curiosity sharp as knives. She kept her head high, her expression neutral as Jonah helped her down from the wagon. His hand was warm and calloused against hers, strong enough to support her weight easily. He didn't release her hand immediately when her feet touched ground, and she looked up at him questioningly. "For show," he murmured. "Might as well look like a real couple." She nodded and left her hand in his as they walked toward the church. The crowd parted slightly, people stepping aside while trying not to look like they were staring. Mara caught fragments of whispers. "That's not Margaret. Who is she? Did you see her clothes? Awfully tall for a woman." Beside her, Jonah's grip tightened, almost imperceptibly. A muscle worked in his jaw. "Jonah Reed!" A cheerful voice cut through the whispers. A man emerged from the crowd, middle-aged, stocky, with a weathered face and kind eyes. "Heard you were coming in today, and this must be a surprise to all of us." "Dutch." Jonah's posture relaxed slightly. "This is Mara Lowell. Mara, Dutch Morrison, our neighbor to the east. Dutch extended his hand and Mara shook it firmly. His eyes widened slightly at the strength of her grip, but his smile didn't waver. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Lowell, though I suppose it'll be Mrs. Reed soon enough. He glanced between them. Ingrid's inside with the children. She'll want to meet you. Always good to have another woman around who understands ranch life. I appreciate that, Mara said, meaning it. An ally, even a potential one, was valuable. Come on then. Dutch gestured toward the church. Reverend's expecting you. Fair warning, he likes to talk. And talk some more. But he's a good man. He'll see you right. They followed Dutch into the church, walking down the center aisle while heads turned and whispers followed. Mara felt exposed under all those eyes, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. She'd survived worse scrutiny than small-town curiosity. Reverend Crawford was waiting for them near the altar, a lean man with silver hair and surprisingly sharp eyes. He shook Jonah's hand warmly, then turned to Mara with an assessing look that she met without flinching. Miss Lowell, he said, I understand there's been a change in plans. Yes, sir. Margaret Hayes fell ill and couldn't travel. She asked me to come in her stead. And you agreed to marry a man you'd never met? Travel hundreds of miles to an unfamiliar place? His tone wasn't accusatory, just curious, probing. Yes, sir. Why? The directness of the question was almost refreshing. Mara glanced at Jonah, who gave her a small nod. Your story to tell. Because I needed to leave St. Louis, she said carefully. And I needed it to be permanent, legal. A marriage contract provides that security. Mr. Reed needed a partner for his ranch. The arrangement is mutually beneficial. Love doesn't factor into your calculation? Love is a luxury, Mara said flatly. Survival comes first. Partnership, respect, honest work, those are things you can build on. Love might come later, or it might not. But at least we'll have a foundation. Reverend Crawford studied her for a long moment, then turned to Jonah. And you, Jonah? You're comfortable with this arrangement? I am. Even though she's not the woman you corresponded with? Even though. Why? Jonah took his time answering. Because she's honest. Because she's strong. Because she'll be a real partner, not just someone playing a role. That's worth more than familiar letters and a photograph that matched expectations. The Reverend's expression softened slightly. All right, let's talk privately, shall we? There are things we need to discuss before the ceremony. He led them into a small office off the main sanctuary. It smelled of old books and beeswax, and sunlight filtered through a dusty window. They sat in wooden chairs that creaked under their weight while the Reverend settled behind his desk. I need to be satisfied that you're both entering this marriage willingly, he began. Miss Lowell, are you being coerced in any way? Threatened? Are you running from danger? No, sir. I'm making a choice. My own choice. And you, Jonah, you're not feeling obligated because you made arrangements and don't want to disappoint? No. If I didn't want to do this, I wouldn't. The Reverend nodded slowly. Marriage is a sacred bond, he said, and Mara tensed, expecting a sermon. But he surprised her. It's also a legal contract with real consequences. You'll be bound to each other in the eyes of the law. Her debts become yours, Jonah. Your property becomes shared. If either of you has secrets or complications, now is the time to speak. Silence stretched in the small office. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had secrets, plenty of them, but none that would affect the legality of this marriage. I have no debts, she said finally. No legal entanglements, no husband or children hidden somewhere. I'm free to marry. Jonah? Same. Ranch is mine, clear title. No debts beyond normal operating costs. No wife or family. All right then. The Reverend pulled out a ledger and began filling in information, asking them questions about dates and places of birth, previous residences, next of kin. The bureaucratic nature of it was oddly calming, just paperwork, just details, nothing magical or romantic about it. When he finished, he looked up at them both. The ceremony will be brief. I'll ask you each to make vows. Do you want traditional words, or would you prefer to speak your own? Mara and Jonah exchanged glances. Traditional is fine, Jonah said. Very well. We'll do it at the end of the regular service. The whole congregation will witness. He paused. You should know, there will be talk, gossip, questions. Are you prepared for that? Let them talk, Mara said, echoing her earlier words. The Reverend smiled slightly. You're stronger than you look, Miss Lowell. That's good. You'll need to be. He stood, signaling the end of their private conversation. Go on out and take a seat. Service starts in 15 minutes. They filed out of the office into the main sanctuary, which was filling steadily now. Dutch Morrison waved them over to a pew near the front where a blonde woman sat with 3 children ranging in age from about 4 to 10. This must be Ingrid. She looked up as they approached, and her face broke into a warm smile. You must be Mara, she said, in an accent that confirmed her Minnesota origins. I'm Ingrid. Please, sit with us. There was something genuine in her welcome that made Mara's throat tighten unexpectedly. She'd been braced for judgment, for coldness, for the careful distance that respectable women often maintained from women like her. But Ingrid just smiled and made room, patting the space beside her invitingly. Thank you, Mara managed. It's good to have another woman at the ranches, Ingrid said quietly, as the church continued to fill around them. Sometimes it gets lonely out there. But we help each other, yes? That's how we survive. The service began before Mara could respond, but she felt the weight of that offer, help, community, friendship maybe. Things she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she deserved. She barely heard the sermon. Her mind was too busy spinning, anxiety and anticipation warring in her chest. Beside her, Jonah sat straight and still, his hands folded in his lap, his face revealing nothing. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tightness around his eyes. Then the sermon was ending, and Reverend Crawford was calling them forward. Mara stood on legs that felt unsteady. Jonah rose beside her, and together they walked to the front of the church while every eye in the congregation watched. She could feel the weight of judgment, curiosity, speculation. Some faces were kind, some neutral, some openly skeptical. She faced Jonah, and he faced her, and Reverend Crawford began speaking words that felt both weighty and surreal. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. The words washed over her. She found herself focusing instead on Jonah's face, the strong lines of it, the steadiness in his eyes, the way he was looking at her like she was real and present, and not just a placeholder for someone else. Do you, Jonah Reed, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. His voice was firm, certain, no hesitation. And do you, Mara Lowell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? This was it. The moment where everything changed, where she committed to a path she couldn't reverse. Behind her, she could hear someone shift in their seat, a child whisper something. The whole town was waiting for her answer. She thought of the life she'd left behind, the fear, the running, the constant looking over her shoulder. She thought of the life she might build here, work, purpose, maybe even peace. I do, she said, and her voice didn't waver. Reverend Crawford smiled. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Kansas, I pronounce you husband and wife. Jonah, you may kiss your bride. Mara's heart stuttered. They hadn't discussed this part. Jonah's eyes met hers, a question in them. Permission asked and granted in a single look. Then he leaned in, and his lips brushed hers, brief and chaste, and somehow more intimate for its gentleness. When he pulled back, his hand found hers and squeezed once. We did it, he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. We did, she agreed, and felt something shift inside her. Not love, not yet, but possibility. The congregation erupted in polite applause, and then they were being congratulated, hands shaken, well wishes offered. Some were genuine, some perfunctory, some edged with barely concealed curiosity. Mara smiled and thanked people and tried to remember names while her mind spun with the reality of what she'd just done. She was married, legally bound to a man she'd known for less than 24 hours. It was insane. It was terrifying. It was done. Dutch clapped Jonah on the back hard enough to make him stagger. Congratulations, neighbor. You'll have to come by for dinner soon. Ingrid will want to get to know Mara properly. We'd like that, Jonah said, and Mara nodded her agreement. Ingrid hugged her, warm and solid. You come by any time, she whispered, even if just to get away for a few hours. Ranch life can be isolating. We women have to stick together. Thank you, Mara said, meaning it more than Ingrid could know. They signed the marriage register in Reverend Crawford's office, making it official in ink and paper and law. Mara's hand trembled slightly as she wrote her name, her old name, for the last time. When she handed the pen to Jonah, their fingers brushed, and she felt that strange spark of connection again, unexpected and unasked for. By the time they made it back to the wagon, the sun was high and hot. Mara's dress felt stifling, and she longed to change back into her practical clothes. Jonah seemed to sense her discomfort. "We can head home," he said, "unless you want to stay in town, get supplies, or—" "Home," Mara said firmly, then caught herself. "I mean, the ranch, if that's all right." Jonah's lips quirked. Not quite a smile, but close. "It's your home now, too. You can call it that." The ride back felt different from the morning journey. They were different now. Legally bound, carrying new names and new responsibilities. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged with awareness. Halfway home, Jonah spoke. "You handled that well, the town, the whispers, all of it. I've had practice being stared at. Want to tell me why?" Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then, carefully, "Maybe someday. Not today." "Fair enough." They crossed the creek and the ranch came into view. Mara felt something settle in her chest at the sight. Not quite belonging, but maybe the beginning of it. Jonah pulled the wagon up to the house and helped her down. This time, when his hands circled her waist, they lingered a moment longer. This time, she didn't pull away immediately. "I'll unhitch the horses," he said. "You should change, get comfortable." Mara nodded and went inside, climbing the stairs to her room. She still thought of it as her room, not theirs, and she was grateful Jonah seemed to understand that distinction. She changed quickly back into her practical clothes, braided her hair tightly, and felt more like herself than she had all morning. When she came back downstairs, Jonah was in the kitchen, pulling food from the icebox. "Figured we should eat something," he said. "It's been a long morning." "Let me," Mara said, moving past him to survey what was available. Bread, cheese, some cold meat, eggs. She could work with this. Within 20 minutes, she had a simple meal prepared. Eggs scrambled with herbs she'd found in the window box, bread toasted over the stove, cheese sliced neatly. Nothing fancy, but solid and nourishing. They ate at the kitchen table, and Mara became aware of Jonah watching her between bites. "What?" she asked. "You cook like someone who's done it a lot. Not fancy, but efficient." "I worked in a boarding house for a while, in St. Louis. Cooked for 20 people 3 times a day. You learn to be efficient." "What else did you do, in St. Louis?" Mara set down her fork. "Why do you want to know?" "Because you're my wife now. Because I'd like to understand who you are." It was reasonable, she supposed. She'd married him. She owed him at least some truth. "I did whatever work I could find," she said carefully. "The boarding house, laundry work, some sewing. For a while I worked in a dry goods store. Nothing lasted long. I kept having to move, find new places." "Because someone was looking for you." It wasn't a question. Mara met his eyes. "Yes. But they're not looking anymore." "No." "You sure about that?" "Yes." She said it firmly enough that he nodded, accepting. "All right, you don't have to tell me the whole story, not today. But eventually, she agreed. "When I'm ready." They finished eating in silence. Mara cleared the dishes and washed them while Jonah disappeared outside. Through the window, she could see him checking on the horses, moving with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his space. This was her life now. This kitchen, this ranch, this man. The strangeness of it threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed the feeling down. She'd survived worse than strangeness. She'd survived this too. By late afternoon, Mara had explored the house thoroughly, taking inventory of supplies, noting what needed attention. The house was clean but sparse, clearly the home of a man who saw no point in decoration. She could work with that. She found Jonah in the barn, working on a broken harness. He looked up as she entered, wiping his hands on a rag. "Something wrong?" "No, just wanted to see what you were doing." He gestured at the harness. "Strap broke yesterday. Been meaning to fix it." Mara moved closer, examining the damage. "You need to replace the whole section. That leather's too worn to just stitch." "You know leather work?" My father was a saddler. I learned young. Jonah held out the harness. Show me. For the next hour, they worked together, Mara's hands sure and skilled as she replaced the worn section with new leather from Jonah's supply, stitching it with strong, even strokes. Jonah watched, asking occasional questions, clearly impressed. You're full of surprises, he said when she finished. So are you. How so? You actually listen. Most men just talk. Jonah smiled, a real smile this time, transforming his serious face. Maybe I like learning things. They worked together until dusk, Mara following Jonah through evening chores, learning the routines of the ranch. Feeding the horses, checking the cattle in the near pasture, gathering eggs from the coop. She moved with confidence, unafraid of the work, her hands capable. Watching her navigate the henhouse without hesitation, Jonah felt something shift in his chest. This woman, his wife, was nothing like what he'd expected, but maybe that wasn't a bad thing. As darkness fell, they returned to the house together. The evening stretched ahead of them, full of uncertain potential. In the kitchen, Mara put water on for coffee while Jonah lit the lamps. You play that violin? He asked suddenly. Mara stilled. Sometimes, when I need to. Would you play tonight? She turned to face him, surprised. You want me to? If you're willing. After a long moment, she nodded. All right, after coffee. They sat in the gathering darkness, drinking bitter coffee and not talking, but the silence felt different now, less like separation and more like companionship growing between two people learning each other's edges. Finally, Mara rose and went upstairs. When she returned, she carried the wooden case reverently. She opened it carefully, lifting out a violin that gleamed even in the low lamplight. Jonah watched as she settled the instrument under her chin, bow poised. For a moment she was perfectly still, gathering herself. Then she began to play. The music that filled the house was haunting, not sad exactly, but full of longing, of memory, of things lost and things hoped for. Mara played with her eyes closed, her body swaying slightly, completely lost in the music. Jonah sat frozen, transfixed. He'd expected competence, maybe, a simple tune. What he got was raw emotion channeled through strings and wood, a window into a soul that carried both beauty and pain in equal measure. When the last note faded, silence rushed back in, but it was different than before, changed. That was, Jonah struggled for words. Thank you. Mara opened her eyes, and they were bright with unshed tears. I haven't played for anyone in over a year. Why not? Because I didn't trust anyone enough to show them this part of me. The weight of that trust settled between them. Jonah understood what she was really saying, that she was choosing slowly to let him see who she truly was. I'm glad you played for me, he said quietly. Mara nodded, then carefully put the violin away. When she turned back, some of her usual armor was back in place, but not quite as thick as before. I should get some sleep, she said. It's been a long day. It has. Jonah stood. Mara, thank you. For today. For saying yes, for trying. You too. She climbed the stairs to her room, and Jonah sat alone in the kitchen for a long time after, thinking about rifle cases and violins, about strength and vulnerability, about a woman who carried both and wouldn't apologize for either. Upstairs, Mara lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She was married. She was safe. She was starting over. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that might be hope taking root in the frightened, guarded places of her heart. Outside, the prairie wind sang through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. The ranch settled into nighttime rhythms, and two people who'd been strangers that morning drifted toward sleep under the same roof, bound by law and contract, and the first fragile threads of something that might someday become more. The days that followed their wedding fell into a rhythm that surprised them both with its ease. Mara rose before dawn, moving quietly through the house so as not to wake Jonah, though she soon discovered he was usually already up, out tending to the animals before first light. They'd meet in the kitchen as the sun crept over the horizon, sharing coffee and planning the day's work with an efficiency that felt almost practiced. She learned the ranch quickly, her mind cataloging details the way she'd learned to catalog exits and hiding places in her previous life. The creek ran cold and clear through the eastern pasture. The barn needed new shingles on the north side. The vegetable garden behind the house had gone to weeds but could be salvaged. Jonah's two seasonal hands, Sam and Red, were good workers but needed clear direction. Jonah, for his part, watched his new wife move through his world and felt his preconceptions crumbling daily. She didn't just help with chores, she improved them, finding more efficient ways to organize the tack room, suggesting better rotation for the pastures, fixing the sticky latch on the chicken coop door with a competence that spoke of real experience. 3 days after the wedding, she was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard the sound of approaching horses. She stood, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, and saw 3 riders coming up the main road. 2 women and a man moving at a leisurely pace that suggested a social call rather than urgent business. Mara wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the house just as Jonah emerged from the barn. Their eyes met across the yard, and she saw the slight tightening of his jaw. He recognized the visitors and wasn't entirely pleased about it. "Town council," he said quietly as she reached his side. "Eleanor Hartwick, Catherine Brennan, and Tom Fletcher. They'll want to inspect you." "Inspect me?" "Essentially." His voice was flat. "They like to know everyone's business. Think of themselves as the moral guardians of Seneca." Mara felt her spine straighten, her shoulders square. She'd faced worse than small-town busybodies. "Then let them look." The riders pulled up in front of the house, and Jonah moved forward to help the women dismount. Eleanor Hartwick was a formidable woman in her 50s, dressed in severe black despite the heat, her steel-gray hair pulled back so tightly it must have given her a headache. Catherine Brennan was younger, maybe 40, with a pinched expression that suggested she found most things in life disappointing. Tom Fletcher was a stocky man with mutton chops and an air of self-importance that Mara instinctively disliked. "Jonah," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "We thought it time to pay a proper call on your new bride. I trust we're not interrupting." "Not at all," Jonah said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Mara, these are some of our neighbors from town." Mara stepped forward, extending her hand. "Mrs. Hartwick, Mrs. Brennan, Mr. Fletcher, it's a pleasure." Eleanor took her hand limply, as if afraid of contamination. "Yes, well, quite the surprise you gave us all, my dear. We were expecting Margaret Hayes." "Circumstances changed," Mara said evenly. "Margaret fell ill and couldn't travel. I came in her place." "How very convenient for you." Catherine's voice dripped with false sweetness. "Finding yourself a husband and a home all in one day." The implication was clear that Mara had somehow orchestrated Margaret's illness, had stolen her place, had trapped poor Jonah Reed into an arrangement he hadn't wanted. Mara felt anger flare in her chest, but kept her expression neutral. "The agency arranged everything properly," she said. "All the paperwork is legal and filed. If you'd like to inspect it—" "That won't be necessary," Tom Fletcher interrupted, though his eyes suggested he'd very much like to inspect something. His gaze traveled over Mara in a way that made her skin crawl. "Though one does wonder about a woman willing to travel so far to marry a stranger. What exactly were you running from, Mrs. Reed?" Beside her, Mara felt Jonah tense, but before he could speak, she laid a hand on his arm, a gentle restraint, and answered herself. "I was running from nothing, Mr. Fletcher. I was running toward something, opportunity, a new start, an honest partnership, the same things anyone would want." She paused, letting her words settle. "Unless you're suggesting there's something shameful about a woman wanting to build a life on her own terms." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "There's nothing shameful about it, dear, but surely you can understand our concern. Jonah is a respected member of this community. We simply want to ensure that his reputation and his welfare aren't compromised by hasty decisions." "His reputation?" Mara repeated slowly. "Not mine. His. Well, naturally." "Naturally what, Mrs. Hartwick? Naturally I'm the suspicious element here? Naturally my character should be questioned while his is assumed beyond reproach?" Mara's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "I'm his wife, legally married before the whole congregation, unless you're suggesting Reverend Crawford performed an improper ceremony." The air crackled with tension. Catherine gasped softly, Tom's face reddened, and Eleanor's expression turned glacial. "We're suggesting nothing of the sort," Eleanor said icily. "We're simply concerned citizens doing our civic duty." "Then consider your duty done." Jonah's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You've met my wife. She's exactly what I needed. Capable, honest, and strong enough to handle this life. If that doesn't meet with your approval, that's unfortunate but ultimately irrelevant. This is my ranch, my marriage, and my business." The words hung in the air, unmistakable in their finality. Tom Fletcher's face darkened further. "Now, see here, Reed." "No, you see here." Jonah's voice didn't rise, but it carried absolute authority. "I appreciate your concern, but I didn't ask for it and don't need it. Mara is my wife, and she'll be treated with the same respect you'd show any married woman in this community. Is that clear?" Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, clearly unaccustomed to being dismissed so thoroughly. Finally, she gathered her reins with sharp, jerky movements. "Quite clear," she said. "Come along, Catherine, Tom. We've obviously overstayed our welcome." They mounted their horses with stiff dignity, and Eleanor looked down at Mara one last time. "I do hope you know what you've gotten yourself into, Mrs. Reed. Ranch life is harder than most city women expect. It would be a shame if you found yourself overwhelmed." "I appreciate your concern," Mara said, matching Eleanor's false sweetness. "But I assure you, I'm quite capable of handling whatever comes." They rode off in a cloud of dust and wounded pride. Mara and Jonah stood side by side, watching them disappear down the road. When they were finally out of sight, Mara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Well," she said, "that went about as badly as it could have." To her surprise, Jonah laughed, a real, genuine laugh that transformed his usually serious face. "Actually, that went better than I expected. Eleanor Hartwick doesn't get told no very often." The look on her face was worth whatever gossip will come from it. Mara turned to look at him. "You're not worried about what they'll say?" "They were already saying it before they rode out here. At least now they know we won't be intimidated." He met her eyes, and there was approval in his gaze. "You didn't back down. I respect that." "You defended me," she said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. You're my wife. That means something." He paused. "Besides, everything you said was right. Your character is your own business, and I won't have people treating you like you're less than because of circumstances beyond your control." Something warm and unexpected unfurled in Mara's chest. She'd been prepared to fight alone, to defend herself without help, the way she always had. Having someone stand beside her instead was foreign and unsettling and oddly comforting all at once. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate but sincere. Jonah nodded, then glanced at the sun's position. "I need to check the fence line in the north pasture before dark. You want to come, or would you rather finish the garden?" "I'll come," Mara said immediately. "I want to learn the property boundaries."
Barnse.
They saddled horses, Jonah on his steady gelding, Buck, and Mara on a sorrel mare named Copper, that Jonah said was gentle but spirited. Mara swung into the saddle with practiced ease, and Jonah watched her settle into position with clear approval. "You ride well," he observed. "My father taught me when I was young, before—" She stopped abruptly, then redirected. "I've always been comfortable with horses. Before." There was a story in that word, in the way she'd cut herself off. Jonah filed it away but didn't push. She'd tell him when she was ready, or she wouldn't. Either way, he could wait. They rode north through knee-high grass that rippled like water in the constant wind. The sky stretched endless above them, brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. Mara breathed in the clean air, felt the sun warm on her shoulders, and allowed herself a moment of something close to peace. "It's beautiful out here," she said, in a stark kind of way. "It grows on you," Jonah said. "Or it doesn't. Some people can't handle the isolation, the emptiness. They need buildings and people and noise. I think I've had enough noise to last a lifetime." He glanced at her sharply, hearing the weight in those words, but again he didn't push. They rode in comfortable silence for another mile before reaching the fence line. Jonah dismounted and began inspecting posts, checking for damage or weakness. Mara joined him, learning as she went, asking questions that showed her practical mind. They were working on a section where the wire had come loose when Jonah suddenly froze, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Mara followed his gaze and saw 3 figures on horseback, silhouetted against the lowering sun, moving slowly along the property line. "Friends of yours?" she asked, though the tension in Jonah's shoulders told her otherwise. "Cattle rustlers, more likely, or scouts for them." His voice was grim. "They've been a problem in the territory this summer. Dutch lost 6 head last month." As they watched, the riders turned and began moving directly toward them. Mara's hand moved instinctively to her side, where she'd have carried her knife if she'd known to bring it. She'd left the rifle at the house, a mistake she wouldn't make again. "Get on your horse," Jonah said quietly. "If I tell you to ride, you ride straight back to the house and don't look back. Understood? I'm not leaving you out here alone. Mara's... No." She turned to face him, her jaw set. "I'm your wife. That means partnership, remember? I don't run." The riders were close enough now to make out details. Rough-looking men, all armed, with the hard eyes of people comfortable with violence. The one in front was tall and lean, with a scar running from his eye to his jaw. He pulled up about 20 feet away, his companions flanking him. "Afternoon," Scar said, his voice carrying false friendliness. "This the Reed property?" "It is," Jonah said, positioning himself slightly in front of Mara. "And you're trespassing." "Just passing through. No need to be unfriendly." Scar's eyes moved to Mara, and she saw something in them that made her blood run cold. Recognition, maybe, or interest, or both. "And who might you be, pretty lady?" "My wife," Jonah said flatly, "and that's all you need to know." "Your wife." Scar's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, congratulations, Reed. Didn't know you had it in you to land someone like her." His gaze traveled over Mara in a way that made her feel stripped bare. "She looks familiar somehow. You from around here, sweetheart?" Mara's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "No. And we're done with this conversation. You're trespassing on private property. Leave." One of the other riders, a stocky man with a crooked nose, laughed roughly. "Got some fire in her, don't she? I like that in a woman." I suggest you move along," Jonah said, his hand resting casually on the rifle secured to his saddle. "Before this gets unpleasant." Scar held up his hands in mock surrender. "Easy there, Reed. We're just being neighborly. Though you might want to keep a closer eye on your stock. Heard there's been trouble with cattle going missing. Would be a shame if your herd got depleted." The threat was barely veiled. Jonah's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "I'll keep that in mind. Now get off my land." For a long moment, Scar just stared at them, something calculating in his expression. Then he tipped his hat mockingly. "Pleasure meeting you, Mrs. Reed. I'm sure we'll see each other again real soon." They turned their horses and rode off at a leisurely pace, making it clear they weren't intimidated. Mara watched them go, her body rigid with tension, until they finally disappeared over a rise. "You know them?" she asked quietly. "The one with the scar is Jake Holloway. Been in trouble with the law more than once, but never anything they could make stick. The others are part of his crew. They've been working this area for months, taking cattle, intimidating ranchers, making life difficult." Jonah turned to look at her, his eyes searching. "But that's not what I'm asking about. He said you looked familiar. Why would he say that?" Mara's throat went tight. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the moment when the past she'd run from came crashing into the present she was trying to build. "We should get back to the house," she said, not quite answering. "It'll be dark soon." "Mara." "Please, Jonah. Not here. Not now." She could see him wrestling with it, his need to know, his respect for her boundaries. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but we will talk about this. Tonight." They rode back in heavy silence, the earlier ease between them shattered. Mara's mind raced, trying to figure out how much to tell him, how to explain without revealing everything. But she'd known this day would come. You couldn't run forever. Eventually, the past caught up. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Mara's stomach wasn't churning with dread. They tended to the horses in silence, moving around each other with the automatic efficiency they'd developed over the past few days. Inside, Mara prepared dinner while Jonah built a fire against the evening chill. They ate mechanically, neither tasting the food. When the dishes were cleared, Jonah poured them each a whiskey. something he'd never done before, and carried both glasses to the table. "All right," he said, sitting down across from her. "Talk to me." Mara wrapped her hands around the glass, drawing warmth from it, and forced herself to meet his eyes. "I told you I was running from something. Someone. I remember. His name is Richard Thornton. He's from a wealthy family in Maryland. Banking, shipping, investments, old money. Respectable." The word came out bitter. "I met him 2 years ago when I was working as a companion to an elderly woman in Baltimore. He was charming at first, attentive. He courted me properly, or so I thought." She took a sip of whiskey, felt it burn down her throat. Jonah waited, patient and still. "He asked me to marry him after 3 months. I said yes. I thought—" Her voice cracked slightly. "I thought I was lucky. A man like him, wanting someone like me. I should have known better." "What happened?" "The engagement was announced, and everything changed. Suddenly, I wasn't a person anymore. I was a possession he'd acquired. He wanted to control everything, what I wore, where I went, who I spoke to. And when I objected, when I tried to maintain any independence—" She stopped, her hand unconsciously moving to her ribs where the worst bruise had been. Jonah's expression darkened. "He hit you?" "Yes. And when I tried to break the engagement, he told me I couldn't, that I'd made a commitment, that his reputation was at stake, that I belonged to him now." Mara's hands tightened around the glass. "So I ran. I took what money I had saved, left everything else, and disappeared into St. Louis. I found work, kept moving, changed my name twice. But he looked for me. Hired men to find me. Like Holloway. Maybe. I don't know if he'd hire someone like that, but..." She met Jonah's eyes. "Richard is the kind of man who doesn't accept losing. If he found out where I was, he'd come for me. Or send someone." Silence filled the kitchen, broken only by the crackle of fire and the wind outside. Jonah drained his whiskey in one swallow, set the glass down carefully. "Does he know you came to Kansas?" "I don't think so. The marriage agency was careful. Everything was under my assumed name. When I married you, I took your name legally. It's the first real protection I've had." She paused. "But if someone like Holloway recognized me somehow, or if word gets back, it won't matter." Jonah's voice was flat, certain. "You're my wife, legally bound to me. Whatever contract or engagement you had with Thornton was broken when you married me. He has no claim. The law won't stop a man like Richard. Maybe not, but I will." Mara stared at him, seeing the absolute conviction in his face. "You don't understand what you're saying. He's powerful, connected. He could make life very difficult for you." "Let him try." Jonah leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You're under my protection now, Mara. That's not just words. Any man who wants to get to you has to go through me first, and I promise you, they won't find that easy." Something broke open in Mara's chest, relief and fear and gratitude all tangled together. She'd been carrying this alone for so long, looking over her shoulder, jumping at shadows. The idea that someone would stand between her and danger, would choose to put himself at risk for her sake, was almost incomprehensible. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that for me?" "Because you're my wife. Because you deserve better than living in fear. Because—" He stopped, seemed to search for words. "Because in the few days I've known you, you've shown me more courage and honesty than most people manage in a lifetime. That means something." Tears pricked at Mara's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She'd cried enough over Richard Thornton. She wouldn't waste more tears on him now. "Thank you," she managed, "for listening, for not sending me away." "Why would I send you away?" "Because I brought trouble with me. Because I wasn't completely honest at the start. Because you did what you had to do to survive." Jonah reached across the table and took her hand, the first time he'd initiated contact that wasn't necessary or practical. His hand was warm, calloused, steady. "That's not something to apologize for." They sat like that for a long moment, hands joined across the table, something shifting between them that was deeper than their careful partnership had allowed for. This wasn't just a practical arrangement anymore. This was real. Finally, Mara pulled her hand back gently. "I should tell you the rest. About the rifle, and why I know how to use it." You don't have to. Yes, I do. She took a breath. After I ran, after the first time Richard's men found me in St. Louis, I realized I couldn't depend on hiding alone. I needed to be able to protect myself. So I found someone to teach me, an old soldier who ran a shooting range. He taught me how to handle a rifle, how to shoot accurately, how to defend myself if I needed to. That's why you travel with it. Yes, and why I won't apologize for it, won't keep it hidden away like something shameful. It represents my refusal to be helpless again. Jonah studied her face in the lamplight. I wouldn't ask you to hide it or give it up. A woman who can protect herself is stronger than one who can't. There's no shame in that. Most men wouldn't see it that way. I'm not most men. I thought we'd established that. Despite everything, Mara felt herself smile slightly. Yes, I suppose we have. Later that night, lying in her bed, unable to sleep, Mara heard footsteps on the stairs and then the creak of floorboards in the hallway outside her door. They paused there, and she knew Jonah was standing just beyond the threshold, perhaps wrestling with whether to knock, to check on her, to say something more. After a long moment, the footsteps moved away to his own room. But something had changed. The walls between them, literal and metaphorical, felt thinner now, more permeable. She'd told him the truth, or most of it, and he hadn't turned away. In his own room, Jonah lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind churning. He thought about the woman sleeping down the hall, strong and scared in equal measure, carrying both a rifle and a violin, running from a past that wouldn't stay buried. He thought about Jake Holloway's calculating stare, about Eleanor Hartwick's judgment, about all the ways this simple arrangement had become infinitely more complicated. And he thought about the fierce protectiveness that had surged through him when Mara told her story, when he'd seen the shadows in her eyes as she talked about a man who'd tried to break her spirit and failed. She was his wife. That had started as a legal convenience, a practical solution to mutual needs. But somewhere in the past few days, it had become something more. A commitment he felt in his bones, a responsibility he accepted not out of duty, but out of choice. Whatever came next, whether Richard Thornton arrived on his doorstep or Jake Holloway's threats materialized into action, they would face it together. The contract had become something real. The arrangement had become a partnership. And though neither of them would say it aloud yet, though both were too guarded and wounded to name it, the foundation of something deeper was being laid, brick by careful brick, truth by hard-won truth, in the quiet spaces between words and in the growing trust that neither had expected to find. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of rain and change. The ranch settled into darkness, sheltering two people learning to stand together against whatever storms might come. The storm broke just after midnight, rain hammering against the roof with such force that Mara jolted awake, her heart racing before her mind caught up with where she was. Not the cramped boarding house room in St. Louis, not the temporary lodgings where she'd hidden and waited and feared. The Reed Ranch, her home now, however strange that still felt. Lightning split the sky, illuminating her small room in stark white flashes. Thunder followed so close behind it shook the windows in their frames. Mara sat up, drawing her knees to her chest, listening to the fury of the storm and trying to calm her breathing. She'd never been afraid of weather, but something about the violence of it tonight set her nerves on edge. A soft knock at her door made her freeze. "Mara?" Jonah's voice, low and careful. "You all right?" She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and went to open the door. He stood in the hallway holding a lamp, still fully dressed despite the hour, his hair damp. "I'm fine," she said. "You?" "Roof's leaking in the back bedroom. Been trying to catch it with buckets." Another crack of thunder punctuated his words. "Thought I'd check on you while I was up." "I can help," she said immediately, turning back to grab her robe. "You don't have to." "I know. I want to." They worked together in the third bedroom, positioning buckets and pans under the steady drips, mopping up water that had already pooled on the floor. The storm raged outside, turning the world beyond the windows into sheets of gray water. "I'll need to patch that section come morning," Jonas said, frowning up at the ceiling. "Been meaning to get to it all summer." "I can help with that too. I worked on a roofing crew for 2 weeks in St. Louis. Didn't love the heights, but I learned the basics." He looked at her with that expression she was coming to recognize, surprise layered with growing respect. You keep surprising me. Is that good or bad? Good. He set down the mop and met her eyes. Definitely good. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and the lamp flickered ominously. They both looked at it, then at each other. We should probably get downstairs, Jonah said. Safer there if the storm gets worse. They retreated to the kitchen where the stone walls felt more solid, more protective. Jonah rekindled the fire while Mara put coffee on to heat. Neither of them suggested going back to bed. Sleep felt impossible with the storm raging like something alive and angry around them. You ever see storms like this back east? Jonah asked, settling into one of the kitchen chairs. Not like this. Baltimore got rain, but nothing with this kind of fury. It's like the sky is trying to tear itself apart. Welcome to Kansas. The land gives you everything and takes it back twice over. You learn to respect it, or you don't survive. Mara poured coffee into 2 mugs and brought them to the table. She sat across from Jonah, wrapping her hands around the warmth, and found herself studying his face in the firelight. He looked tired, she realized, lines around his eyes she hadn't noticed before, a weariness that went deeper than one sleepless night. How long have you been doing this alone? She asked quietly. Really doing it, I mean. Not just surviving, but trying to build something. Jonah took a long drink of coffee before answering. 5 years since my father died. But even before that, he was sick for 2 years before the end. So I was running things mostly on my own for 7 years, give or take. That's a long time. It is. He stared into his coffee. Sometimes I think I forgot what it was like to share things, to have someone to talk to at the end of the day, someone who cares if you come home safe. My mother used to say that was the hardest part of ranch life, not the work, but the isolation. She died when I was 16, and I watched my father just fade after that. Like without her, there wasn't enough reason to keep fighting. The vulnerability in his words made Mara's throat tight. Is that why you sent for a bride? Because you didn't want to fade like he did? Maybe. Or maybe I just got tired of the silence. He looked up at her. But I'm glad it was you who stepped off that train, not Margaret Hayes. Even with all the complications I brought? Especially with them. Margaret seemed nice enough from her letters, but she was looking for safety, for someone to take care of her. That's not partnership, that's dependency. You're not looking to be rescued, you're looking to stand on your own feet with someone beside you instead of behind you. Is that what you think I'm doing? Isn't it? Mara considered that. Outside, the rain continued its assault, but the thunder was moving farther away now, the storm's rage beginning to spend itself. Yes, she said finally. I spent 2 years being afraid, always moving, never settling. I was surviving, but I wasn't living. Coming here, marrying you, it was the first real choice I'd made in longer than I could remember. Not running away from something, but choosing something. And now that you're here, now that you've had a few days to see what this life really is, now I'm more certain than I was at the station. She met his eyes directly. This isn't easy, and I don't expect it to become easy. But it's honest. You're honest. There's no pretense here, no games, just work and weather and trying to build something real. I can respect that. I can be part of that. Jonah nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. When Holloway and his men showed up yesterday, you didn't run. You stood there ready to fight even though you were scared. I was terrified, she admitted. But you stood anyway. That's the difference. That's what partnership looks like. They sat in comfortable silence after that, drinking coffee and listening to the storm gradually diminish. By the time the rain had gentled to a steady patter, the sky beyond the windows was beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. Going to be a muddy day, Jonah observed. Good day for inside work, then. I saw the pantry needs organizing, and those curtains in the front room are held together by hope and stubbornness. You don't have to, I know, but I want this place to feel like a home, not just a house you're camping in. That's part of building something, isn't it? Making it better than it was. Jonah studied her for a long moment, then smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger. Yeah, I suppose it is. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, shaped by the storm's aftermath and the work it created. They patched the roof together, Mara proving as capable as she'd claimed, her hands steady even when the height made her nervous. They cleaned out gutters, redirected runoff, reinforced weak spots in the barn's foundation. But they also began to make smaller changes, the kind that transformed a functional space into a home. Mara sewed new curtains from fabric she found in town, simple but clean and bright. She organized the kitchen with an efficiency that made cooking easier. She planted herbs in a box outside the kitchen window, basil and thyme and rosemary that would be ready by late summer. Jonah, watching these transformations, felt something in his chest loosening incrementally, like a muscle held tense for so long he'd forgotten it was tight. The house was becoming something different under Mara's influence, not just his father's house that he maintained, but a space they were building together. 2 weeks after the storm, Ingrid Morrison rode over in the late afternoon. Mara was in the garden pulling early carrots when she heard the horse approach and looked up to see her neighbor dismounting with practiced ease. "I hope I'm not intruding," Ingrid called out, her accent warm and friendly. "I brought you some bread. I made too much this morning and I thought you might like some." Mara stood, brushing dirt from her hands and knees. "That's kind of you. Please, come in. I'll put coffee on." They settled in the kitchen, and Mara found herself relaxing in Ingrid's presence. There was no judgment in the other woman's eyes, no calculation, just genuine friendliness. "How are you settling in?" Ingrid asked, accepting a cup of coffee gratefully. "Better than I expected, honestly. Jonah is—" Mara paused, searching for words. "He's a good man, a fair one." "He is. He and Dutch have been friends for years. Dutch speaks very highly of him." Ingrid took a sip of coffee. "But I didn't come just to bring bread, if I'm being honest. I wanted to make sure you knew that you have a friend, if you want one. Ranch life can be isolating, especially for women. We need to support each other." The simple generosity of it made Mara's eyes sting unexpectedly. "Thank you. I'd like that very much." "Good. Then you must come to dinner soon, both of you. Dutch would enjoy the company, and the children would love to meet you properly." Ingrid paused, then added carefully, "I heard about Eleanor Hartwick's visit, and about how you handled it." "I probably made things worse," Mara said. "No, you made things clear. That's different." Ingrid's expression turned fierce. "Eleanor thinks she runs this town, and nobody ever stands up to her. It was past time someone did. She's been spreading gossip about you, of course, but most people with sense don't pay her much mind." "What kind of gossip?" "The usual, that you're too independent, too bold, that you trapped Jonah somehow, that you're probably hiding some terrible secret." Ingrid rolled her eyes. "Small-minded nonsense, mostly, but I wanted you to know so you're not caught off guard if you hear whispers in town." Mara felt her spine straighten. "Let them whisper. I've survived worse than small-town gossip." I believe you have." Ingrid reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly. "You're stronger than you look, Mara Reed. That's good. You'll need to be." After Ingrid left, Mara stood in the doorway, watching her ride away and feeling the weight of those words. "You'll need to be strong." It wasn't a warning exactly, more like recognition, one survivor acknowledging another. That evening, Jonah came in from the fields earlier than usual, his face troubled. Mara looked up from the stove where she was preparing dinner and immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" "Found fresh tracks along the north boundary, multiple horses moving slow like they were surveying the property." His jaw tightened. "Holloway's crew, most likely, or someone like them." Mara's hand stilled on the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. "They're planning something." "Looks that way. Dutch said he saw them in the area yesterday, too. They're getting bolder." He leaned against the doorframe, suddenly looking exhausted. "I should have hired more hands this season, should have anticipated this." "You can't anticipate everything. I can be better prepared." He straightened. "Tomorrow I'm riding into town to see the sheriff, let him know what's happening, and I'm moving the cattle closer to the house, where we can keep better watch." "What can I do?" He looked at her seriously. "Keep that rifle of yours close. And if I tell you to get inside and bar the door, you do it. No arguments." "Jonah? I mean it, Mara. These men are dangerous. I won't risk—" He stopped, jaw working. "I won't risk you getting hurt because you're too stubborn to take cover." The intensity in his voice surprised her. This wasn't just practical concern. This was something deeper, more personal. In the 2 weeks since she'd told him about Richard Thornton, something had shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained was eroding, replaced by something neither of them had quite named yet. "All right," she said quietly, "but the same goes for you. You're not invincible, no matter how much you act like you are." His expression softened slightly. "Fair enough." The next morning, Jonah rode into town while Mara stayed at the ranch with strict instructions to stay alert. She worked in the garden but kept the rifle propped against the fence within easy reach. Every sound made her jump, the wind rattling the barn door, a horse whinnying in the pasture, birds taking sudden flight. By the time she heard hoofbeats approaching in the early afternoon, her nerves were stretched taut. But it was Jonah returning, and she felt relief flood through her at the sight of him. He dismounted heavily, his expression grim. "The sheriff's not doing anything," he said without preamble. Says without direct evidence of theft or violence, his hands are tied. Suggested we post more watch, keep better records of our stock. Basically told me we're on our own. That's it? That's it. He did say there have been reports from other ranches, missing cattle, damaged property, threats, but nothing he can act on legally. Jonah's hands clenched into fists. "We're going to have to handle this ourselves." Over the next week, they established new routines shaped by the threat hanging over them. Jonah moved the cattle to the south pasture, visible from the house. They took turns on watch each night, one of them staying up while the other slept. Mara learned to shoot Jonah's Winchester, practicing until her aim was steady and sure. On the 6th night of their new vigil, Mara was on watch, sitting on the porch with the rifle across her knees and a lamp turned low beside her. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the sky like thrown seed. She'd been hearing nothing but normal night sounds, insects, distant coyotes, the wind in the grass, when suddenly the cattle in the south pasture began to low uneasily. Mara stood immediately, every sense alert. She could see dark shapes moving among the herd, too deliberate to be animals. Men on foot, trying to cut out several head without spooking the rest. She moved quickly but quietly to the bedroom where Jonah slept. "Jonah?" she whispered urgently, touching his shoulder. He came awake instantly, reaching for the pistol he kept by the bed. "What is it?" "Someone's in the south pasture, at least 3 men that I can see." He was up and moving before she finished speaking, pulling on his boots, checking his rifle. "How long?" "Just started. They're trying to be quiet." "Go wake Sam and Red in the bunkhouse. Tell them to bring their rifles and meet me at the pasture gate. Then you get back inside the house and stay there." "Jonas, please." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were fierce. "Please, just this once, don't argue with me." The raw emotion in his voice stopped her protest. She nodded and ran to wake the ranch hands while Jonah headed toward the pasture. By the time she'd roused Sam and Red and they'd armed themselves and gone to join Jonah, Mara was standing in the kitchen doorway, the rifle in her hands, torn between the promise she'd made and the urge to run toward the confrontation. She could hear shouts now, see lanterns moving in the darkness. Then a shot rang out, sharp and clear in the night air. Mara's heart stopped. She was moving before she could think, running toward the pasture, her earlier promise forgotten in the flood of fear. She couldn't just stand there while Jonah might be hurt, She reached the fence line and saw chaos. The cattle were spooked, milling and bellowing. Sam and Red had their rifles raised, keeping 3 men covered. And Jonah was standing, whole and unharmed, his rifle pointed at Jake Holloway. "Next shot won't be in the air," Jonah was saying, his voice carrying clearly. "Get off my land, now!" Holloway's face was twisted with rage, but he was smart enough to see he was outgunned. "This isn't over, Reed. You can't watch your stock every night forever. Sooner or later, you'll make a mistake, and I'll put you in the ground where you belong." Jonah's voice was cold as winter steel. "That's not a threat. That's a promise. Now move before I change my mind about letting you leave on your feet." Holloway and his men backed toward their horses, mounted up, and rode off into the darkness. But before they disappeared, Holloway looked directly at Mara, where she stood at the fence line, recognition and calculation in his eyes. "Pretty wife you got there, Reed," he called back. "Be a real shame if something happened to her while you were busy watching your cattle." Jonah raised his rifle, but they were already out of range, swallowed by the night. He lowered the gun slowly, his entire body vibrating with suppressed violence. "Sam, Red, do a full count of the herd. Make sure they didn't get any." He turned to find Mara standing there. "What are you doing out here? I told you to stay inside." "You were shot at. Did you really think I'd just stand there?" "I thought you'd keep your promise. And I thought you'd be more careful than to face down armed men in the dark." Her voice rose despite her best efforts. "You could have been killed, Jonah." "So could you have been, running out here like that?" He strode toward her, his face hard. "If they'd gotten past us, if Holloway had seen you standing there alone with that rifle, then I'd have shot him." She lifted her chin. "I told you, I don't run. Not anymore." They stood there glaring at each other, both breathing hard, both terrified for each other and too proud to say it directly. Finally, Jonah's shoulders sagged. "I can't lose you," he said quietly. "I just got you. I can't—" The raw vulnerability in those words hit Mara like a physical blow. She closed the distance between them and did something she'd never done before. Reached out and pulled him into an embrace. He stiffened in surprise, then his arms came around her, holding her tight enough to hurt, his face pressed against her hair. They stood like that in the darkness, while the frightened cattle settled and Sam and Red moved among them. Two people learning what it meant to care for someone else's safety more than your own. "I'm sorry," Mara whispered against his chest. "I'm sorry I broke my promise. But I heard that shot and I couldn't not know if you were all right." I know. His arms tightened. "But you have to understand, if something happened to you because of me, because you were here on my land facing threats that are mine, they're ours now. That's what marriage means, remember? Your threats are my threats. Your fights are my fights." He pulled back just enough to look down at her face in the starlight. "When did you get so brave?" "When I decided I had something worth being brave for." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to fully acknowledge. Jonah lifted one hand and cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "We should get inside," he said, but he didn't move. "We should," she agreed, but she didn't pull away. For a long moment they just stood there, caught in something neither had planned for, neither had expected. Then slowly, carefully, Jonah leaned down and kissed her. Not the brief, chaste kiss of their wedding, but something deeper, more real, a claiming and a question and a promise all at once. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily. "Inside," Jonah said again, his voice rougher now, "before I forget every good intention I've had about taking things slow." Mara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but didn't look away. "Maybe slow isn't what we need anymore." His eyes darkened. "Mara, I'm not saying tonight. I'm not saying rush. But I am saying—" She took a breath. "This is becoming real, Jonah. What we have. It stopped being just practical somewhere along the way, and pretending otherwise seems foolish now." "When?" he asked. "When did it change for you?" She thought about it. "Maybe when you defended me to Eleanor Hartwick, or when you listened to my story about Richard without judgment, or maybe it was just all of it, all these small moments adding up to something I didn't expect." "For me it was the violin," Jonah said quietly. "When you played for me that first night, I saw who you really were underneath all the armor, and He stopped, shook his head. "I'm not good with words." "You're doing fine. What I'm trying to say is, this scared the hell out of me tonight, thinking you might be hurt, realizing how much I'd come to—" He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "How much you've come to matter." "You matter too," she whispered. They walked back to the house hand in hand, something fundamental having shifted between them. The contract had become a commitment. The partnership had become something deeper, not quite love yet, but the foundation for it, solid and real and growing stronger with each passing day. Inside, with the lamps lit and the doors barred, and the rifle loaded and ready by the door just in case, they sat together at the kitchen table and talked until dawn about what came next. They would need to hire more hands, increase security, perhaps even consider building a higher fence around the main pasture. But underneath all the practical planning was something else, the knowledge that they were in this together, truly together, no longer two people sharing space, but two people building something worth protecting. As the sun rose over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Jonah looked across the table at his wife. this fierce, complicated woman who'd stepped off a train with a rifle and a violin and changed everything, and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for longer than he could remember. She looked back at him and smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she looked like she believed she might actually stay. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of all the things they'd learned about each other, all the moments they'd survived together, all the possibilities stretching ahead of them like the endless prairie beyond their windows. They'd started as strangers bound by contract. They'd become partners through necessity, and now, tested by threat and fear and the simple act of showing up for each other day after day, they were becoming something more, something neither had dared hope for, but both were learning to trust. Outside, the ranch woke to a new day, solid and real and theirs. 3 weeks after the confrontation with Holloway, the first real cold snap of autumn arrived, bringing with it a clarity to the air that made distant objects stand out sharp and clear. Mara stood at the kitchen window watching Jonah and the 2 new hands he'd hired working to reinforce the corral fence, their breath visible in the morning chill. The ranch felt different now, more populated, more secure, but also more theirs. The extra hands meant Jonah didn't carry the entire burden alone, and the increased patrols had kept Holloway and his crew at bay. There'd been no more incidents, though everyone remained watchful. Dutch had reported seeing the gang working ranches to the west, and word was the territorial marshal had finally taken an interest in their activities. But the biggest change wasn't in the external circumstances. It was in the way Jonah's hand found hers across the table at meals, in the way she'd taken to playing violin some evenings while he sat and listened, in the way their conversations had deepened beyond practical matters into real intimacy. They still maintained separate bedrooms. Some boundaries took time to cross, but the walls between them were growing thinner with each passing day. She was pulling bread from the oven when she heard an unfamiliar horse approaching. Through the window, she could see a well-dressed man on a fine bay gelding, riding with the posture of someone accustomed to being noticed. Her stomach clenched instinctively. Strangers still made her wary, but she forced herself to set down the bread and walk calmly to the door. Jonah had already spotted the rider and was moving toward the house, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. The new hands, Ben and Cole, had stopped working and were watching alertly. The stranger dismounted with practiced ease and removed his hat, revealing silver-streaked hair and a face that spoke of expensive grooming and comfortable living. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good morning. I'm looking for the Reed Ranch. I believe I've found it." "You have." Jonah's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "What's your business here?" "My name is Harrison Cole, attorney at law from St. Louis. I'm here on behalf of a client regarding a private matter." His eyes moved past Jonah to where Mara stood in the doorway, and something flickered in his expression, recognition, confirmation. "I believe your wife and I should speak." Mara felt ice flood her veins. Richard had found her after all. Of course he had. She'd been foolish to think she could disappear completely, that a man with his resources would simply give up. "Anything you have to say to my wife, you can say in front of me," Jonah said flatly. "I'm afraid this is a delicate matter, Mr. Reed. Perhaps if Mrs. Reed and I could speak privately—" "No!" Jonah didn't move, but his presence seemed to grow larger, more immovable. "Whatever you came here to say it now, or get back on your horse and leave." Harrison Cole sighed, as if dealing with unreasonable children. "Very well. I represent Mr. Richard Thornton of Baltimore, Maryland. It has come to his attention that the woman currently residing here as your wife is in fact Miss Mara Lowell, formerly engaged to be married to Mr. Thornton. That engagement was never formally dissolved, and Mr. Thornton has concerns about the legality of your marriage." "The engagement ended when she left," Jonah said coldly. "And she's not Miss Lowell anymore. She's Mrs. Reed, legally married with all proper documentation filed with the territory. Your client has no claim." Mr. Thornton would dispute that. He invested considerable resources in preparing for his marriage to Miss Lowell, announcements, arrangements, financial commitments. Her departure caused him significant embarrassment and monetary loss. He believes he's entitled to compensation. He can believe whatever he wants. She doesn't owe him anything. Cole's smile turned patronizing. "Mr. Reed, I understand you're new to these legal complexities, but I assure you breach of promise is a serious matter. Mr. Thornton has documented evidence of the engagement, witnesses to the agreement, proof of his expenditures. He's prepared to pursue legal action if necessary. Mara found her voice finally, stepping forward to stand beside Jonah. I broke no promise. There was no marriage, no legal contract beyond Richard's assumptions. He doesn't own me, and he never did. Miss Lowell, pardon me, Mrs. Reed, I don't think you fully appreciate the situation. Mr. Thornton is a man of considerable influence. He has connections throughout the territory, including here in Kansas. If he chooses to pursue this matter, he can make life very difficult for you and your husband. Let him try. Jonah's voice was pure steel. We're not intimidated by threats, legal or otherwise. Cole's expression hardened slightly. This isn't a threat, Mr. Reed. It's a reality. However, Mr. Thornton is a reasonable man. He's authorized me to offer a settlement. If Mrs. Reed agrees to return to Baltimore and honor her original commitment, he's willing to overlook all of this unfortunate business. He'll even consider compensating you for your inconvenience. The audacity of it struck Mara like a physical blow. Richard thought he could buy her back, as if she were property to be purchased and returned. The presumption, the arrogance, it was so perfectly him that she almost laughed. Tell your client, she said, her voice shaking not with fear but with rage, that I would rather die than go back to him. Tell him I'm married to a good man who treats me with respect and equality. Tell him that every day here is worth more than a lifetime in his gilded cage. And tell him that if he comes near me or my husband again, I will shoot him myself and answer for it gladly. Cole's eyebrows rose. My dear woman, you can't be serious. She's absolutely serious, Jonah interrupted. And so am I. You go back to Baltimore and you tell Thornton that Mara made her choice. She chose me, chose this life, chose freedom. That's worth more than all his money and influence combined. He has no legal standing here, and if he tries to pursue this, we'll fight him every step of the way. Mr. Reed, I strongly advise you to reconsider. Consideration done. Get off my land. Cole looked between them, seeming to assess whether further argument would be productive. Finally, he reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Mr. Thornton anticipated you might be unreasonable. This is a formal notice of intent to pursue legal action. You'll want to retain counsel. He held it out, and when neither of them reached for it, he set it on the porch railing. You have 30 days to respond. He mounted his horse with the same practiced ease, settling into the saddle and looking down at them with something that might have been pity or disdain. For what it's worth, Mrs. Reed, Mr. Thornton genuinely cared for you. He's offering you a chance to return to a life of comfort and security. This ranch, this rough existence, it's beneath you. Surely you can see that. The only thing beneath me, Mara said clearly, was believing I deserved the way he treated me. I see clearly now. Tell Richard I'm exactly where I belong. Cole shook his head and rode away, the sound of his horse's hooves gradually fading until the ranch was quiet again except for the wind. Mara stood perfectly still, her hands clenched into fists, every muscle tight with the effort of not shaking. She felt Jonah's hand on her shoulder, warm and solid. You all right? No, but I will be. She turned to face him. He found me. After everything, he found me. And now he knows exactly where you stand, that you're protected, that you have people who'll fight for you. Jonah's jaw was set. We'll talk to a lawyer in town, make sure everything is iron tight legally. But Mara, he can't take you back. The law is on our side. The law doesn't always matter to men like Richard. He has money, connections, power. And you have something he can never buy or intimidate, a will stronger than his and people who stand with you. Jonah's hands moved to cup her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. I meant what I said. We'll fight him, whatever it takes. Ben and Cole had approached cautiously, both looking concerned. Boss, you need us to do anything? Ben asked. Keep watch like we have been. If that lawyer comes back or anyone else asking questions about Mara, I want to know immediately. Jonah glanced at the son's position. And one of you ride to Dutch's place. Let him know what's happening. He should be aware in case Thornton tries to gather information from the neighbors. After the hands dispersed, Jonah picked up the envelope Cole had left and they went inside. The bread Mara had been baking was cooling on the counter, filling the kitchen with the scent of normalcy even as everything felt tilted and wrong. She sat at the table while Jonah opened the envelope and read through the legal documents, his expression darkening with each page. "It's mostly bluster," he said finally. "Legal language designed to intimidate. But there's no real case here. You were never married, there was no legally binding contract, and your marriage to me is completely legitimate." He set the papers down. "Still, we should have our own lawyer review this. Make sure we're not missing anything." "Richard won't stop with legal threats." Mara's voice was quiet but certain. "He doesn't accept defeat. If the law doesn't work, he'll try something else." "Then we'll deal with that too." Jonah moved to sit across from her, reaching for her hands. "Listen to me. You're not alone in this anymore. You don't have to face him by yourself." "But you shouldn't have to face him at all. This is my past, my problem." "It's our problem now. That's what marriage means, remember?" He smiled slightly, echoing her own words from weeks ago. "Your fights are my fights." Despite everything, Mara felt herself smile back. "When did you get so wise?" "Must be all the good advice I've been getting from my wife." They spent the afternoon in town, meeting with Thomas Brennan, the only lawyer in Seneca, and unfortunately, husband to Catherine who'd visited with Eleanor Hartwick. But Brennan proved to be more professional than his wife, reviewing the documents thoroughly and assuring them their legal position was solid. "Cole is fishing," Brennan said, handing the papers back. "Thornton has no case for breach of promise without a formal written contract, which it appears he doesn't have. Your marriage is legal and binding. The worst he can do is make noise and waste everyone's time with frivolous litigation." "But he could do that?" Mara asked. "He could try, but any judge worth his salt would throw it out immediately. Kansas courts don't look kindly on wealthy Eastern men trying to reclaim women who've legally married here. Smacks too much of treating women as property." Brennan leaned back in his chair. "My advice? Document everything. If Thornton or his representatives contact you again, keep records. If he attempts any form of coercion or intimidation, that's harassment, and we can pursue criminal charges." It was more reassurance than Mara had expected, and some of the tightness in her chest eased slightly. Jonah paid Brennan's fee, and they started back toward the ranch as afternoon shadows lengthened. They were halfway home when they saw smoke. Black smoke, thick and oily, rising from the direction of the ranch. Jonah's face went white, and he urged the horses into a gallop, Mara holding on as the wagon bounced and rattled over the rough road. The barn was burning. Flames engulfed the northern wall, spreading rapidly through the dry wood. Ben and Cole were already there with buckets, fighting desperately to contain it, but the fire had too much of a head start. Jonah leaped from the wagon before it fully stopped, running toward the barn. "The horses! Get the horses out!" Mara was right behind him, her heart hammering. The heat was intense, smoke making her eyes water, but she could hear the terrified whinnying of the animals trapped inside. Jonah burst through the barn door into the smoke-filled interior, and Mara followed without thinking. Inside was chaos. 3 horses were in their stalls, eyes rolling white with terror. Jonah was already working on the first stall door, flinging it open and slapping the horse's flank to drive it toward the exit. Mara ran to the second stall, her hands fumbling with the latch as smoke burned her lungs. "Get out!" Jonah shouted at her through the smoke. "Not without the horses!" She got the latch open and drove the second horse out. The third stall was closest to the fire, flames licking along the wall above it. The horse inside was Buck, Jonah's steady gelding, and he was rearing and screaming, too panicked to understand the door was open. Jonah reached the stall just as part of the burning wall groaned and began to collapse. Mara saw it happening in horrible slow motion, the timber falling, Jonah directly beneath it, no time to move. She threw herself forward, shoving him hard to the side. They both went down in the straw as the burning timber crashed down where Jonah had been standing. Heat seared along Mara's arm, and she smelled burning cloth and worse. Then Jonah was dragging her up, half carrying her toward the door, while Ben appeared from nowhere to grab Buck's halter and force the panicked horse toward safety. They burst out into the clean air, coughing and gasping, and didn't stop until they were well clear of the barn. Mara collapsed onto the ground, her arms screaming with pain. Jonah was beside her immediately, his face sooty and terrified. "Your arm! Jesus, Mara, your arm!" She looked down and saw her sleeve was burned away, the skin beneath angry red and blistering. The pain hit her fully then, and she bit back a cry. "Ben, ride for the doctor," Jonah shouted. "Cole, keep fighting that fire. Save what you can." He scooped Mara up as if she weighed nothing and carried her toward the house, his jaw set, his eyes fierce. Inside, he laid her on the kitchen table and began cutting away what remained of her sleeve with swift, careful movements. "I need to get this cooled down," he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "It's going to hurt." "Do it," she gritted out. He brought cold water from the pump and gently poured it over the burn. Mara couldn't stop the cry that escaped her. The pain was blinding, all-consuming. Through it, she felt Jonah's free hand grip hers, holding tight. I'm sorry," he was saying over and over like a prayer. "Almost done. Just a little more." When the initial treatment was done, he wrapped her arm carefully in clean cloth and stood back, his hands shaking. His face was streaked with tears cutting through the soot. "You saved my life," he said roughly. "You could have been killed. So could you have been." Mara's voice was weak but steady. "That's what we do now. We save each other." The doctor arrived an hour later and treated her burn properly, leaving salve and instructions for care. The barn fire had been contained to just the structure itself. The animals were safe, and the house and other buildings were undamaged. But the barn was a total loss. As the doctor packed up his supplies, Jonah walked him out, and Mara heard their conversation through the open door. "She'll be all right," the doctor was saying. "The burn is painful, but not dangerous. Keep it clean, change the dressing daily. She'll have a scar, but she'll heal." "How did it start?" Jonah asked. "The fire?" "Your man Cole found this near the barn." There was a pause, then the sound of something metal being handed over. "Lamp oil can, deliberately placed from the looks of it." The implications settled over Mara like ice water. Not an accident, arson. And there was only one person who would benefit from driving them off their land, from making their life untenable. When Jonah came back inside, his face was carved from stone. "Thornton, or someone working for him, maybe Holloway. He'd be easy to hire for something like this. Cole's riding to get the sheriff, for all the good it'll do. But this crossed a line. This was attempted murder." Jonah's hands clenched into fists. "He tried to kill us, Mara, both of us. What do? We fight back. Smarter, harder, better than he expects." Jonah's eyes blazed with determination. "And we don't do it alone." Over the next 2 days, something remarkable happened. Word of the fire spread through the community, and Dutch Morrison arrived with lumber and tools. Then Tom Fletcher showed up, the same Tom Fletcher who'd been part of Eleanor Hartwick's Inquisition, with more supplies. Ingrid came with food and offers to help with whatever was needed. Even Eleanor Hartwick herself appeared on the third day, stiff and formal, but carrying a basket of preserves and bandages. "I was wrong about you," she said to Mara without preamble. "Catherine told me how you handled that lawyer, and Tom said you went into a burning barn to save livestock. That's not the behavior of a woman with questionable character. That's the behavior of a rancher's wife." She set the basket down firmly. "You're one of us now, whether I initially approved or not, and we take care of our own." Mara felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected acceptance. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwick." "Eleanor, we're neighbors after all." The barn raising took 6 days. Men from surrounding ranches came to help, bringing their skills and their labor. Women brought food and organized the work. Children ran messages and fetched tools. The entire community came together in a show of solidarity that left both Mara and Jonah humbled. Dutch pulled Jonah aside on the 4th day, his expression serious. "Heard some news from town. The territorial marshal caught up with Jake Holloway and his crew, caught them red-handed with stolen cattle. They're all in custody now, singing like canaries about who hired them for various jobs." Jonah's eyes sharpened. "The barn?" "Can't prove it yet, but Holloway mentioned a gentleman from back east who paid him to cause trouble for a specific ranch. Marshall's investigating. If it leads back to your friend Thornton, there could be criminal charges: arson, attempted murder, conspiracy." "Good. There's more. Word is Thornton himself showed up in Topeka 3 days ago, making noise about his rights, throwing money around, trying to find people who'll say Mara belonged with him. Mara, who'd been close enough to overhear, felt her stomach drop. He's here, in Kansas. About 60 miles east, Dutch confirmed. But here's the thing. Nobody's willing to support his story. The folks he's talking to? They're all saying the same thing. That Mara Reed is legally married, properly settled, and a valued member of this community. They're telling him to go home. He won't listen, Mara said quietly. Maybe not, but he's not getting the support he expected. And with the marshal investigating his connection to Holloway, he's on shaky ground legally. Dutch looked between them. You've built something here, both of you. People see that. They respect it. Thornton doesn't understand that this isn't Baltimore where money can buy anything. Out here, character matters more than bank accounts. That evening, with the new barn 3/4 complete and the community effort winding down, Mara stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Her arms still ached, but the pain was manageable now, a reminder of what she'd risked and why. Jonah emerged from the house and stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. They watched the sun sink toward the horizon in comfortable silence. I've been thinking, Jonah said finally, about what we should do if Thornton actually shows up here. And? We face him together. We show him exactly what he lost when you walked away. Not just you, but the life you've built, the person you've become, the home we're making. He turned to look at her. We show him that love, real love, not ownership or control, is stronger than anything money can buy. Mara's breath caught. Love? Jonah smiled, soft and genuine. You think I haven't figured that out yet? I love you, Mara. Not because you're convenient or useful, not because you fit some idea I had about what a wife should be. I love you because you're brave and strong and complicated. Because you play the violin with your eyes closed and shoot a rifle with them open. Because you ran into a burning barn without hesitation. Because you chose this life. Chose me when you could have chosen safety and comfort with him. Tears streamed down Mara's face, unchecked. I love you too. I didn't mean to. I tried not to. But somewhere between arriving with nothing but a rifle and a violin and building this life with you, I fell completely in love with you. He pulled her carefully into his arms, mindful of her injured arm, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. This wasn't the desperate kiss of the night they'd faced Holloway. This was something deeper, a promise and a claiming and a celebration all at once. Marry me again, he said against her lips, properly this time, not because we have to, not out of necessity, but because we choose it, choose each other. We're already married, I know, but I want to stand in front of everyone who matters and tell them I choose you. That this wasn't just a transaction that worked out. This is love. Real love. The kind people write about and sing about and build entire lives around. Then yes, I'll marry you again. I'll choose you every day for the rest of my life. They stood wrapped in each other's arms as darkness fell and stars emerged. Two people who'd started as strangers and become everything to each other. The sound of an approaching horse made them pull apart. In the dusk, they could see a single rider coming up the road, moving fast. As he drew closer, Mara recognized the uniform. The territorial marshal. He dismounted near the porch and tipped his hat. Mr. and Mrs. Reed, Marshal Davis. I apologize for the late hour, but I thought you'd want to know immediately. We've taken Richard Thornton into custody. Mara's hand found Jonah's, gripping tight. On what charges? Conspiracy to commit arson, attempted murder, and about 6 other charges related to his hiring of Jake Holloway's gang. Turns out Thornton wasn't as careful covering his tracks as he thought. We have written correspondence, payment records, witness testimony from multiple members of Holloway's crew. He's looking at serious prison time. He'll buy his way out, Mara said, her voice hollow. Men like him always do. Not this time. The territorial governor has taken a personal interest in the case. Seems there's been a pattern of wealthy Eastern men coming out here thinking they can operate above the law. The governor wants to make an example. Davis pulled out a document. I need Mrs. Reed's statement about her history with Thornton, particularly any evidence of prior abuse or coercion. For the next hour, by lamplight on their porch, Mara told her story fully for the first time. Not just the parts she'd shared with Jonah, but all of it. The gradual isolation, the escalating control, the violence, the terror. The marshal took notes carefully, asking questions, building a case. When she finished, he folded his papers and stood. "Ma'am, what you've described is more than enough for additional charges. Combined with what we have on the arson, Thornton is going to spend a long time in a territorial prison. He won't be threatening you again." After the marshal left, Mara and Jonah sat in stunned silence. "It's over," Mara said finally, as if testing the words. "It's really over. It's over. You're free, completely free." She turned to him, and her smile was radiant. "No, not free. Freely chosen. There's a difference." The wedding, their second real wedding, took place on a crisp October morning with the whole community in attendance. Mara wore a new dress that Ingrid had helped her sew, simple but beautiful, in a shade of blue that matched the Kansas sky. Jonah wore his best suit and couldn't stop smiling. Reverend Crawford performed the ceremony on the porch of their rebuilt barn, the entire structure decorated with prairie flowers and autumn leaves. When he asked if they took each other freely and willingly, both answered with absolute certainty. "I do. I choose this. I choose you." The celebration lasted into the evening, with food and music and dancing. Mara played her violin, and for the first time she played with pure joy rather than longing or sorrow. The notes soared into the prairie night, and everyone who heard them understood they were witnessing something remarkable. Two broken people who'd found each other and become whole. Later, after the guests had left and the ranch was quiet again, Mara and Jonah stood on their porch watching the stars emerge one by one. "Do you remember what you expected?" Mara asked. "That day at the station?" "A quiet woman. Someone plain and manageable who wouldn't disrupt my life too much." "And what did you get?" Jonah pulled her close, his arms encircling her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "A force of nature. A woman with a rifle and a violin, with courage enough for both of us, with a heart that refused to be broken even when the world tried its hardest. I got everything I needed instead of what I thought I wanted." "I was so scared," Mara admitted. "When I stepped off that train, I was running and hoping and desperate all at once. And now? Now I'm home, really home. Not because of the place, but because of you, because of us." She turned in his arms to face him. "The contract we signed that day was supposed to be practical, businesslike. But what we built was love. Real, messy, complicated, beautiful love." Jonah kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "The kind that chooses to stay when things get hard. The kind that runs into burning barns and faces down the past. The kind that builds a future worth believing in." They went inside together, leaving the door open to the prairie wind and the endless stars. The house was theirs now, truly theirs, filled not with the lonely silence of isolation, but with the comfortable quiet of genuine companionship. In the months and years that followed, their story became part of the community's fabric. The ranch prospered. Children came, 3 of them, each one learning to ride and shoot and play violin, raised by parents who taught them that strength and tenderness weren't opposites but complementary forces. Mara never forgot where she'd come from or what she'd survived. The scar on her arm remained, a permanent reminder of the night she'd chosen love over safety, chosen partnership over survival. But she wore it without shame, a badge of honor that spoke of courage and commitment. And Jonah never stopped being grateful for the day his careful plans were disrupted by a woman who'd stepped off a train carrying everything she needed to survive and nothing she needed to pretend. She'd been the wrong woman by every measure he'd established, which made her exactly right in every way that mattered. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were in bed, Mara would take out her violin and play while Jonah listened, his eyes closed, his heart full. The music spoke of journeys and choices, of losses transformed into gains, of 2 people who'd found in each other not rescue, but recognition. The ranch stood solid on the prairie, a testament to what could be built when 2 people chose each other freely and completely. Not a mail-order marriage, not a desperate arrangement, but a love story written in sweat and soil and starlight, in every decision to show up and stay and build something real. The woman who'd arrived with secrets and scars had become a wife, a partner, a force that shaped the very land she walked on. The man who'd ordered a convenient solution had found instead an equal, a challenge, a love that demanded everything and gave back twice as much. Together, they'd created not just a home, but a legacy, proof that the strongest foundations aren't built on certainty and careful planning, but on the courage to say yes to the unknown, to choose freely even when afraid, to believe that love is found not in getting what you expect, but in embracing what arrives. The prairie wind sang through the grass as it always had and always would, indifferent to human hopes and fears. But within the stone walls of the Reed Ranch, two hearts beat in rhythm, two lives intertwined completely. Two people who'd learned that the best things in life are never ordered but chosen, never planned but discovered, never expected but deeply, profoundly, perfectly right. And when strangers asked them years later how their story began, they would smile and say simply, "She stepped off a train with a secret, and he was brave enough to let her keep it until she was ready to share." Everything else followed from that first act of trust, that first moment of choosing to see possibility instead of disappointment, to embrace reality instead of clinging to expectation. It was a love story for the ages, not because it was easy or perfect or free from struggle, but because it was real, chosen freely, built deliberately, maintained with dedication and devotion through storms both literal and metaphorical. The mail-order bride who wasn't, the cowboy who got more than he bargained for. Two people who found in each other not what they ordered, but what they needed, not what they planned, but what they were meant to become. And they lived the kind of life worth living, full of work and weather, of challenges met and overcome, of love that deepened with every passing season, of a partnership so strong it could weather any storm because it was built not on convenience, but on choice. Their story ended, as all stories must, but the love they built continued, carried forward in their children and their children's children, in the ranch that still stands, in the memory of two people who proved that the greatest love stories aren't found in fairy tales, but in the daily choice to stand together, to fight together, to build together something worth more than either could have created alone. She'd arrived with a rifle and a violin. He'd offered her a contract and a home. Together, they'd created a love that transcended both practical necessity and desperate hope, becoming something neither had imagined, but both had needed more than breath itself. And on quiet prairie nights, when the wind was right, some said you could still hear violin music drifting across the grass. The sound of a woman who'd learned she was strong enough to survive alone, but wise enough to choose partnership. The echo of a love that was never ordered, but freely, completely, beautifully chosen.